Yeah, but on the other hand,
1400.
changes lots of weeks.
The poker
No, I
community
think
at
it's more
large,
this weekend. It
certainly
hasn't
among the
very-
high-stakes echelons, has a number
That's
of people who have been
Think of
incredibly philanthropic. And I think
18 months ago where it
if you're
changed.
going to commit yourself to playing poker for a living,
Maybe America-centric, but not much of the world.
Check.
at some
you
point
suggest
you come
voting.
across
Yeah.
how deeply unfulfilling it can be and how repetitious and monotonous it can be.
It's a pretty big one.
And close your ears, Landon.
Hard to fight.
You're still green and short in the tooth. But stuff like this, I think, really helps create a little bit more balance and gives you some purpose and some meaning and helps you recognize just how far a lot of the money that you're able to compile can go.
Gives
Do
meaning
good.
to it.
Yeah.
World, then we had 30 years of unipolar. Now we're back in multipolar, it seems like.
Multipolar.
Ace of Clubs brings some additional meaning to King Deuce as
Like, the last 30 years kind of the
Sylvia
US set the
now
rules for
picks
the
up
world.
King High.
All right, so Jake Daniels, very much known for being a bluffy guy, but he did not continue bluffing on the turn. We'll get to that in a second. Let's go back to the flop, talk about how Jesse is playing the hand so far. A lot of players are going to want to bet a king on this flop. Jesse didn't. He wanted to check call mode. What do you think about that?
I think it's the right play. It's really hard to get called by very many worse hands. Daniels doesn't have that many pocket pairs. Some of those are going to be 3 bets. So you can really only get value out of a 6. We can't get value, of course, out of a king because we have the worst possible kicker. If Daniel has an ace, not only is he not folding, we're valuing ourselves. But if we check, we give Daniels the chance to bluff, as indeed he does. So we open up Daniel's range when he puts chips into everything, potentially, not just hands that want to stick around when we bet.
Right. I think it's a bit of a different story if we have something like King, Queen, or King, Jack. Then there's all of the weaker kings that we can get value from. Daniels doesn't have that many aces, having that 3-bet pre-flop. But King Deuce feels like a very clear check. And, of course, never a fold when Daniels bets because we open it up for him to bluff, which he does. Feels like probably the right move to bluff here, though. I mean, we do have some equity against against everything, but it's not amazing equity, but we can actually get him to fold some hands. Jesse's going to be a balanced enough player that he's going to have some check folds, right?
Yeah, I think he is. Not a huge amount. He's going to have a lot of calls here, so we shouldn't bet very much. But this also gets us to the river very cheaply. As we see, we get to check it back on the turn. So we can bet a little bit here, get to see 2 cards. Sometimes a jack or a 10 is going to be good because Jesse will have like pocket 9s or something like that. We get 2 shots at the queen and at least a little bit of fold equity on the flop. Of course, we could decide to bluff the turn or bluff the river if we wanted to. I think on the whole, we should probably bet this in position rather than check here. And then some of Jesse's bluffs or misses that he was going to just check fold on the turn, he might turn into bluffs and get us off the hand. That doesn't sound great when we could have just won the hand sometimes.
Yeah, so I like Daniel's betting. I like his sizing, going small. I think this is all good. Jesse, of course, has to call. The turn is a great card for Jesse, obviously. He doesn't lead, and we don't think he should consider leading. Now, it's kind of interesting. It's still a kicker-based issue, right? Because I think it's a pretty interesting play to lead a hand like King, Queen of Clubs or King, Jack of Clubs. The wrinkle in that is, of course, that if Daniels is a very bluffy guy, then there's fewer kings in his range and more bluffs. But if we have King, Queen, or King, Jack of Clubs, we have a ton of equity against pretty much everything, and all of Daniel's weaker kings are going to check back. So we get to build a pot, get more value that way. But with King Deuce, we're losing to all of the kings, and they're all going to call us on this card. So we can't really do it with this hand, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This feels like we just have to check because although we pick up cool equity and that ace is good for us, we're just going to fold out all the bad hands and get action from all the hands that are beating us. And why would we want that?
Yeah, the flush draw is not enough to make that an intriguing proposal, right?
Right.
And then Daniels, as you see, checks back really quite quickly. Should he consider continuing the bluff here?
I think he mostly shouldn't. I think he mostly should be taking the free card, seeing if he can improve. He always has the option to bluff the river. This card is one that is probably not going to get too many folds out of Jesse. If Jesse has a bad ace, he's obviously sticking around. I think he would check some bad aces on the flop. If he has a king, I don't think he's ever folding a king either on this
I don't
card.
think so. Maybe to a pot-sized bet.
Maybe, but
Yeah.
against the well-known bluffer Jake Daniels,
maybe not.
It seems tough to get him off. Now, again, if we have a 3-street plan and we try and barrel this one through, we're going to get some kings to fold, I think. But that means we have to do this kind of thing a lot when we've got a hand like this, and then we're just doing it too much.
Yeah, we need a better reason to do it. I mean, picking up clubs is definitely something we could have done with a random 2-club hand. We could have Jack 10 with a club in it at least to make it a little bit more enticing. We block some of the club draws from getting in against us if we have a 3-barrel plan. So yeah, if we did it with this hand, it would probably be doing it with too high of a frequency. So it's probably a good check back.
Yeah, Jack 10 of clubs, Queen 10 of clubs makes sense to continue for sure.
Oh, of course. But even
others-
like Jack of Clubs 10, you could do that
That's
sometime.
at least a little better.
Yeah. Jack of Clubs 10, That would be a fun hand to play on Nitrogen Sports, wouldn't it, Jonathan?
Yep.
Especially in our monthly tournament. Tell them all about it.
Yeah, they have these special 10s with no suit at all now. It's very exciting.
I love it.
That's a lie. Hey, but what we do have is at the end of every month, our special Poker Guys invite-only Nitrogen Sports tournament. The only way to get into this tournament is if you click the link on our pinned tweet. That's how you sign up for Nitrogen. Once you've done that, then you get access to all of these monthly tournaments, and there's always a massive overlay. Thousands of dollars extra Nitrogen puts in there.
Get in there, get you some poker.
That's going to be the case going forward.
Yeah, but
It's been pretty clear.
yeah, I was
Daniels
saying.
Trending.
snap
that
check
for so
back
long.
Trending,
after
but
taking a
it's
shot
That's
with the
what I was
Broadway
gonna say. Like,
gutty.
I don't think this is a big thing because I thought that was
Doesn't
like
improve on the
writing
end.
on the wall for like 18, 20 years now.
Yeah, but imagine if you're sitting in some other country deciding whether or not to risk your life
Oh, for
for
sure.
something related to the U.S. Like,
Yeah.
it's going to be different a year ago compared to today.
I don't know. I'm just of the belief that none of that really matters. I don't think like who the quote-unquote world power is has like much say on a global scale for humanity.
Just makes me think of
Like,
Wow. Wow. I mean, brain scrambled. Okay, we have to talk about this call by Jake Daniels, but first, I know it's exciting, but first let's just step back and look at Jesse's decision. Okay?
Yep.
Jesse on this river, it's a really interesting spot. He's got the worst king possible. Should he be betting for value here, or should he be checking and trying to induce a bluff?
Well, we now know that he should be betting for value.
Well, yes.
I think Daniels might have just checked back with Jack 10 if he thought it was good enough to win when bet into. It's possible he might have just checked back.
Yeah.
So
Maybe not, though, because the bet makes him think it's different.
sure, but let's try to divorce ourselves from the knowledge of what happens.
Okay.
And look at this from Sylvia's perspective before we know that Daniels calls with Jack 10. It is a really tough spot because you have to kind of weigh the different things that could happen here. Is Daniels going to call with a 6 if we bet? I think it's close. I mean, he might not because Jesse did check call the flop. That means he has something, and it's almost always better than a 6, right?
Is Jesse ever going to value bet a 6 on this river? That would seem to make no sense.
Right.
So what are we supposed to be able to beat as Daniels? I guess whatever Daniels thinks he's beating with Jack 10, but really, what are we supposed to be able to beat? Like you said, when Jesse check calls the flop, unless he's got some crazy fancy play syndrome, which I guess at times he's been known to have, but like you're really counting on a lot for him to show up with like 8-9 suited here or something.
So then the other side of the coin is, do we expect Daniels to bluff with hands that are worse than King Deuce if we check? Knowing Daniels, I would say probably yes, with some frequency. But he did check back the turn really fast. Maybe that's part of why Sylvia decided to bet.
Maybe. Or maybe Jesse just knows his customer.
Maybe Jesse just knows his customer because if Daniels is going to call with Jack 10, and this is like a questionable bet by Sylvia, it feels like maybe it's not so questionable.
No, not at
Maybe he
all.
actually really knows that Daniels is a guy who's going to call with a lot of stuff.
Which means every 6, if he somehow rivers a 5, every 5, any other pocket pair, all the way down to deuces. Queen highs, maybe, because clearly Jack highs here. It feels like it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's some problems here with this call. Let's talk about the call now.
Okay, let's talk about it.
All right. So in order to get to a spot where we feel like even a 6 can beat Jesse Sylvia, you have to, as we just referred to, put Jesse on a fancy play syndrome hand. Something that's like a suited connectors with 2 back doors on the flop, like 4-5 suited. You know, I guess not a 5 because a 5 got there.
Okay.
3-4 suited, you know?
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm going to make it look like I have to have something of value. And this is how I do it by taking this line that looks super strong. Most people aren't really going to follow through with these intensely fancy play syndrome plays because you don't know how the board's going to run out, right? It works just better just to bet, you know, when you have a range advantage on this board.
I mean, Ace, King, 6, Rainbow is such a great board for Jesse to bluff on.
All right, so let's assume for a second, though, that as Daniels, we have this magical knowledge that Jesse does have this fancy play syndrome, and at least a portion of his range is made up by just complete air.
Fine.
We still have to choose hands to call with and which not to, that we got here with, and the way we do that is using distribution. We are very low in our distribution, and we block his most reasonable bluffs, which are Queen Jack and Queen 10 and Jack 10, which, by the way, we're chopping with at best. We're actually losing to those hands. So we have kings in our range we can call with. We don't really have aces in our range, right?
Very
When we
rarely.
check back the turn, we don't have that, so we can forget about that. But we have plenty of kings in our range that we wouldn't bet the turn with,
Yep.
at least some of them. We have 6s in our range for sure.
For sure.
And we have some 5s in our range. And then, by the way, we have queen highs, which we probably shouldn't call with either.
We have deuces, we have trays, we have 4s, we may have 7s
Yeah.
in our range. We might even have as high as 8s in our range sometimes. Not that often, I would think, but sometimes. We just have so many better hands than Jack 10, which beats nothing except this crazy, super fancy play thing. And by the way, I watched all 4 hours of this cash game, and Jesse never made a fancy play like we're describing, not once. Not
All
like
right,
this.
yeah,
Not
so-
like this.
So it feels like a mistake, even if you add in the very unlikely fancy play syndrome
Yes.
attachment to Jesse Sylvia. So I think Daniels maybe ultimately just didn't want to get bullied by the pro. Like maybe that's what was going on. Like Jesse Sylvia is this really well-known pro.
He is.
So you got to make sure you keep him in line. Like I got nothing else.
The only thing we could come up with on the podcast that at least maybe makes a little sense is Daniels calls really fast. He knows this is a stream where everyone's going to get the card information 30 minutes later. So everyone's going to see that he called with Jack high here. And so maybe it's worth $1,800 to him to call here and let everyone know they shouldn't try and bluff him the rest of the day.
Yep, and he's not turning his hand over because, you know, you would only turn your hand over if you're really trying to do that, and you don't want to let people
Exactly.
know you're trying to do that. You have to be kind of secretive about it.
So now you have to give up a half hour of value
Yeah.
for that, and you only get like another 2 hours. But maybe that's all I got. Or he forgot how the hand played out is the only other thing which you came up with.
Yeah.
Like maybe he thought that Jesse bet the flop and he called.
Which is still makes it a very thin call, but it's at least better because Jesse didn't have to have anything when he bet the flop. He kind of had to have something when he check called the flop.
Exactly. Now he can have 8-9 suited again if he bet the flop, but he didn't.
Yeah, I don't know about this one. All right, here is the solver analysis. This work was done by Wesley Cannon. Let's start back with the flop. We mostly agreed with the solver on the flop. The solver wanted Sylvia to check with this hand.
Yeah.
Wanted him to bet if he had a kicker, but he doesn't have a kicker. So that's basically what we said. Also wanted Daniels to bet and bet small, which seemed logical to us. The one thing of interest on the flop was that it thought that Sylvia could check a hand with two backdoors or backdoor draw of any kind, but also thought that Sylvia could check call with a hand like that, which is pretty interesting and something I would pretty much never do. I would either bet it or check fold it. And, you know, the check is with the hope that maybe Daniels will check back and I can semi-bluff if I improve, right?
Yeah, two back doors would be something like 7-8 of diamonds on this board. It seems so hard for me to believe that Jesse, in practice, in theory, whatever, but in practice, after having raised pre-flop and being out of position, by the way, against Jake Daniels in his very wide calling range in the big blind, is going to check call 8-7 of diamonds out of position against this player. It just seems so hard to believe. Now, I guess I could be wrong about that, but man, that seems unlikely.
It doesn't feel like something I would ever do.
Yeah.
That's for sure. But, you know, if the solver thinks that maybe that means it thinks that Daniel's call on the river is a little better. 'Cause
Yeah,
that
that's
was
true.
a big key for us is saying, like, what the hell is Sylvia check calling with on the flop that he's now bluffing with on the river? I guess we found it, at
That's
least
right.
from the solver's perspective.
This at least opens the door to Daniel's call being more reasonable.
Well, we'll
if
get
this
to
is
that.
there.
We'll get
Okay.
to that, and we'll see what the mystery holds.
Ooh.
But first, the turn, which Sylvia playing in flow made plenty of sense, and the solver agreed with that. But Daniels can bet King X for value, which we said he could bet at least his good kings for value.
Yeah,
we thought.
for sure.
Maybe not his bad kings, but his good kings for sure he could bet for value, which I guess the solver thinks means he can include all of his semi-bluffs in his continuing betting range, including Jack 10 with no club, which, you know, ultimately we decided we didn't like that much. And he checked back, which we agreed with. But I guess the solver didn't like that play.
This is partially a function of believing that Jesse's got a lot more trashy hands in his range
Yes,
here,
of
even though he
course.
check called, right? So it's like I can get all those hands to fold, but then getting bluffed out by them with my Jack high on the river.
Right.
Right.
Right. It all goes back to what you expect Sylvia to have check called with on the flop.
Right.
Which, you know, let's get to the big question here on the river.
Okay.
The solver is really wide for Jesse Sylvia's value betting range. Like we thought King Deuce made sense after talking about it. Although it was a little questionable as to
It was
actually getting
close.
called, but then we saw Jake Daniels call with Jack 10, so we're like, oh, of course Jesse Sylvia knows
Right.
his opponent. That wasn't a solver based thing. It's just he knows this guy is going to call. But actually the solver thinks Sylvia can bet 6x plus for value, which
seems hard to believe. Again, if the solver thinks that Jesse's going to be in there with a bunch of trashy just two backdoor type hands, and now has to get rid of some of them and doesn't want to just lose the pot every time. The way he would get rid of them, of course, is to bluff here,
Right.
And hope it works. That would reasonably work a lot against Jake's range, right? So then because of that means Daniels is going to have to call a little bit wider, and because of that, then you can get back to betting sixes. And to get called by what? I worry about that. Like fives?
Yeah.
Worse sixes? What if we have a bad six,
how about
though?
Jack 10, which Jake Daniels did call
Yeah.
with? And here's the big question. Did the solver like that? Well, it did say that he can call wider than you might expect.
Yeah.
But definitely not with this.
That's too much,
The solver
man.
did not like Jake calling with this hand.
Mm.
He blocked some of Sylvia's most obvious bluffs was one of the reason. And by the way, he's losing to those bluffs still. So that's a problem.
Or chopping.
Or chopping, yeah. So yeah, despite the solver being wider in pretty much all aspects than we thought, it still didn't want Jake to call with this hand on the river.
Interestingly enough, yeah, the solver does want Jake to call with pretty much any pair and some queen highs even.
Yeah.
So that's good enough, but that way you can beat the jack highs of the world or even maybe some of the other queen highs.
Yep. Anyway, that's the solver stuff. We'll see you guys next time.